Once Upon a Time, a short story written and narrated by Robert Fairhead from the Tall and True writer's website. This story begins at the end, but my time spent observing your planet has taught me humans like to process events and information in an orderly, if not entirely predictable sequence. So forget the first sentence, and I'll serve you a linear tale. Just don't skip to the end and spoil it. Part 1. An early UN climate change conference in the 1990s. Our protagonists enter the main conference area stage left and right. A pair of dedicated young scientists, heads down, poring and worrying over data and projections. They collide and papers fly everywhere. "For goodness sake, watch where you're going," she explodes and kneels to collect her papers from the floor. "You too," he retorts, also kneeling. Clutching their mixed up piles, they apologise awkwardly, introduce themselves and find a table to separate and sort the papers. Remember, humans like orderly information. It's an unpromising start to a relationship which, despite conference gossip, will remain professional and never romantic. But it's also the beginning of a long-term collaboration between two scientists keenly concerned about the effects of climate change. How do I know this? Because, unlike you, I'm not limited to linear timelines. Part 2. A post-pandemic UN climate change conference in the 2020s. And our more mature protagonists are catching up at a social event after the first day's plenary session. "How are the children?" she asks, clinking his glass. "Both at university," he replies, adding, "The years have flown by, so fast." "Too fast," she comments. "With too little action," he reflects. They sip their drinks in contemplative silence for a few moments before dissecting the day's speeches. The projections and promises, the depressing reports of illegal logging and deforestation, and the lack of progress on reducing carbon emissions, and the emergence of a block of climate change adaptists, seemingly intent on hijacking the conference agenda. "Are we too late?" she asks. "No, it's never too late," he asserts, clinking her glass, "for hope and action." Our protagonists have matured, but retain the optimism of young scientists. Optimism is another endearing trait I've noticed in humans. Part 3. A UN Climate Adaptation Conference in the late 2050s. Our protagonists are much older, and although both are retired, they have accepted an invitation to address a forum on the conference sidelines. "It's down to the wire," she says in closing, still sounding strong and determined. "But with goodwill and purpose," he adds, pausing to grip the lectern to steady the tremor in his hands and voice, "we can reverse the effects of climate change." The applause is generous, but it's not the main conference hall, and our protagonists give each other a resigned look, acknowledging those days and hopes are in the past. Once upon a time, a pair of dedicated young scientists tried to save the world from climate change. But you know that, even with your linear limitations. And how does our story end? That's up to you. I'm only here to observe your planet. Hi, I'm Robert Fairhead from Tall and True Short Reads and the Tall and True writer's website. I wrote Once Upon a Time in June 2022 for the Australian Writers' Centre's quarterly writing competition, Furious Fiction. The brief for the 500-word short story was, it had to begin with a sentence containing exactly 6 words, include something being served, and use the words stage, wire and log. Longer variations were acceptable as long as they retained the original spelling. Fittingly, the 6-word sentence popped into my head first. This story begins at the end. And it also signposted the ending, so I knew my writing destination. I wanted to play with form and point of view in the story, so I came up with the idea of an omniscient narrator, possibly otherworldly, and not limited to linear timelines. However, our narrator has observed that humans like to process events and information in an orderly sequence, and so serves the reader a 3-part linear tale of 2 scientists dedicated to saving the world from climate change. We follow the scientists from their first meeting at a UN climate change conference in the 1990s to their collaboration catch-up at a post-pandemic UN conference in the 2020s and joint address on the sidelines of a UN climate adaptation conference in the late 2050s. In addition to form and point of view, I wanted to write a story on climate change about how scientists have warned us of its existence for decades, while vested interests have denied it or urged us to adapt rather than take action to halt and reverse its effects. I found places for the required words from the brief and the story, although I took advantage of being allowed to use longer variations for one of them. Did you hear the words? And for the sentence callback at the end of the story, I used a classic beginning. Once upon a time, a pair of dedicated young scientists tried to save the world from climate change. But as our narrator observer explains, how this story ends is up to the reader. I hope you enjoyed my linear tale with a message. You can read Once Upon a Time and all my short stories, blog posts and other writing at tallandtrue.com. You can also buy my short story collections, including my latest collection, 12 More Furious Months, from the Amazon Kindle and Kobo online bookstores. Links are available in the show notes. The next episode of Tall and True Short Reads will be in your podcast feed shortly. In the meantime, check your feed or the podcast website, tallandtrueshortreads.com, for earlier episodes from seasons 1, 2 and 3. And follow or subscribe to the podcast and rate and review it via your favourite app. Doing so helps me share my writing with other listeners. You can support this podcast financially by making a small one-off or regular donation via the Acast supporter page. You'll find a link in the show notes. And finally, please tell your family and friends about Tall and True Short Reads and the Tall and True Writers website.